Okay. Welcome everyone to Roundabout Books event with Michelle Nijhuis for Beloved Beasts. My name is Julie. I'm the events manager at Roundabout Books. If you're joining us for the first time, thank you so much for being here on Zoom. We're so grateful that we have this platform to bring us authors who might not be able to travel to Bend normally, especially during this time. I just want to remind everyone, Roundabout is open every day from 10 to 5. We are still doing our owl delivery once a week. And of course, you can still order online or for red bench pickup. So that's it for me for the store news. We're going to go ahead and get started because I am very excited to hear about this book. So Michelle, I'm just going to give a quick introduction in your bio. Michelle Nijhuis is a project editor at The Atlantic, a contributing editor at High Country News, and an award-winning reporter whose work has been published in National Geographic and the New York Times Magazine. She is co-editor of the Science Writer's Handbook and is joining us from White Salmon, Washington tonight. So Michelle, take it away and tell us about Beloved Beasts.
Thanks so much, Julie. It's great to be here. I'm happy to visit Bend virtually because in better times I visit it often. My in-laws live in Sun River, so I know Bend well and I know Roundabout well. So I'm happy to be visiting your community, if only virtually. Um, I'm going to share my screen because I do have a few slides to show you, and then I'm just going to talk for about half an hour, and then we can open it up to questions or discussion or whatever people are interested in knowing more about. So, come on. There we go. So I call what I have to say finding hope in conservation history because that was one of the most unexpected and pleasant benefits of diving into conservation history for a couple of years because I think the historical perspective has a lot to show us and give us, especially in such a difficult field and complicated field like conservation. Often the historical perspective, the long view can show us that we've accomplished a lot more than we think. Um, but before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about my book writing process, which this is a highly abridged version, as you shall see. Uh, in some ways, my book started back in 1996. This is me 25 years ago. I majored in biology in college. I was a field tech for a couple of years after college, moving around the desert Southwest, working seasonal jobs that led to a whole lot of really cool encounters with beautiful places and incredible creatures. You can tell this was taken 25 years ago because not only do I look very different, but that big thing that I'm holding, that big stick, is a GPS antenna. And I think what I was doing at the time was taking GPS coordinates for the perimeter of our study site so that we would have them stored. And of course, I was lugging this giant thing around, but anyone could probably come up with a much quicker and more accurate reading just using the phone in their pocket. So technology's changed it a bit. The So working these wildlife jobs was a ton of fun, but it also brought me up close with some of the controversies over endangered species that were taking place in the West at the time and continue to take place, of course, all over the world. And what really impressed me about those controversies, which were quite passionate and sometimes even violent, was that people were arguing about what seemed like these very basic, very profound questions about what our relationship to other species was and is and should be. Instead of arguing about the specifics of, how are we going to close this ORV trail or that one? Are we going to stop this housing development or that one? I went to these public meetings where people were like, why should we bother with this species? Why is it important? Whose responsibility is it? Do we even care? And I thought, we don't have agreement over, these very basic uh, ideas about how we should relate to other species. And surely some people must have come up with some answers in the past. But like most people interested in conservation. Most conservationists, I didn't, and didn't for a long time have a very strong sense of the conservation movement's history. I think conservationists tend to see other species, or I mean, I'm sorry, tend to see their own history as kind of, a vague assemblage of famous people, but they don't think of it as a movement, as a tradition that's grown and changed over time, mostly understandably because they're preoccupied with the future and the next emergency. They don't often take the time to look back at their own history. So these experiences left me with a ton of questions, which I continue to pursue for the next 25 years. And finally, I wrote a book, and that's the end of the story. But in those parentheses, I became a journalist. I had some training in biology, but I became a journalist and I started writing about conservation and climate change and environmental issues and throughout the West and all over the world eventually. And I continued to be struck by just how little agreement we had about those big questions. And I continued to be interested in conservation history. And I eventually decided to try my hand at writing a book about it because no one, at least not to my knowledge, had really, of course, people have written tons of biographies of prominent conservationists and have written about different eras in conservation history. But to my knowledge, no one has tried to sum up the history of conservation or represent it uh, from beginning to end in a book that is a reasonable length. And this was so I took on this challenge. I soon found out why no one had done it. It was incredibly difficult, but it also was a very joyful process in many ways because it was an opportunity for me to delve into some of the answers that people had come up with to those big questions and look at how the answers had evolved over time and look at where they might be going next. So that was a challenge I set for myself. There were times when I seriously regretted it, but overall I was very glad to, perhaps I was glad not to know how difficult it was going to be before I took it on, because I was very in the end very satisfied that I had been on that journey. So I want to tell you a couple of stories from the book, mostly from early conservation history, and with the hopes of whetting your appetite for more. So my book does go from the late 1800s to the present day, and then takes a look into the future. So I think most of our experiences with conservation, unless we are conservation professionals, tends to be through the media. And this is a highly unscientific sample of headlines from the past week. Uh, Separating elephant species shows they're closer to extinction than scientists thought. 3 whales on the path to extinction in US waters. More than 10% of American fireflies nearing extinction. A year after Australia's wildfires, extinction threatens hundreds of species. And this one I find especially sad because it's about actually about a very positive effort, but still in the headline is extinction fears drive the Wildlife Trust rewilding campaign. This is a headline from the UK. And this is, I mean, what I'm about to say is not in any way to take away from the importance of these issues and of the real tragedy that these, or potential tragedy that these headlines are describing. But you can almost write a mad lib of these stories. I think we've all read stories about, this highly endangered species is threatened by X. If nothing is done, it's going to go extinct in X year. And here are some things that people have to say about how sad they are that it's no longer going to be in existence. And again, not to take away from the fact that those are real tragedies and those are real losses. But I think what gets missed in this well, as a journalist, I'll call it the use of extinction as our only news peg for conservation, is that the conservation movement knows that conservation is about much more than just preventing extinction, especially it's about much more than preventing extinction of single charismatic, highly vulnerable species. It's about protecting relationships, and conservation has learned this from the science of ecology. It's about protecting relationships among species, between species and habitats, and between humans and other species. And that last one has been the most belated realization, I think, of the conservation movement. And it's really where I see conservation having to go next, is figuring out at last those ever-changing, extremely complicated relationships between humans and other species, and how we can possibly um, alter them so that we can guarantee the long-term survival of more species than we can now. So one of the things that I found very memorable in my early research on the book is that extinction is a relatively new idea. I think if you've grown up, uh, if you grew up having a dinosaur phase, if you've raised someone who had a dinosaur phase, if you've known someone who went through a dinosaur phase, you're very familiar with the concept of extinction, and it's sort of baked into us. We take it for granted that it's something that happens, that's happened in the past, and that it's something that humans can cause. Well, it turns out that it wasn't until the very early 1800s, late 1700s, that scientists in Europe realized that there had been some species on Earth before us and that they were no longer around. Before that, people thought that species were static creations of God and that they didn't appear or disappear. We just had the same assemblage of them that we'd always had forever and ever. And so that was the first realization of extinction. And it wasn't until the mid 1800s when Darwin came along with his theory of evolution through natural selection, in which he quietly suggested that humans could, in fact, cause extinction and already had, that people started to grok the idea that humans could have something to do with this thing called extinction. And a few years after Darwin, we got Alice in Wonderland, in which Lewis Carroll uh, was so intrigued by the extinction of the dodo that he actually made his own alter ego in the book, a dodo. And the dodo at that point had been extinct for a couple of hundred years. It had disappeared so long ago that some people doubted that it existed. It was considered kind of this mythical beast. And the idea that humans might have caused its extinction from the islands in the Indian Ocean where it lived, a revived interest in this creature. And it became very posthumously a symbol of extinction that we still use today. So people realized that it was possible for humans to drive species extinct on isolated islands, but it wasn't until decades after that, after Alice in Wonderland, after Darwin, that people came to terms with the fact that we could also drive physically large, very abundant species to extinction. And the most famous case of that is, of course, the American bison, which was nearly hunted to extinction after, darkening the plains with herds that were millions strong for millennia. The commercial hunting spree that unfolded over the course of the 1800s very quickly drove the bison almost to extinction. And it took a long time for people to realize this was possible. At least people who didn't live near the bison. The people who lived near it were very aware that this was going on, but the people who were not were first, once they realized it was possible, they entered into another sort of denial where they said, well, this must be inevitable. This is sad, but it's the price of national progress. And it took a man named William Hornaday, who is an extremely complicated character, as I'll tell you about in a second. But he was fascinating to learn about. He was ironically a taxidermist and trophy hunter who came to work at the Smithsonian, realized the supply of bison specimens at the Smithsonian was slim to none, and then realized there were no more bison specimens to be gotten for the museum's collection. And he, contrary to what everyone around him was saying, he said, no way, this is not inevitable, and we have a responsibility to do everything we can to stop it, to stop the extinction of the American bison. And he did a lot of things to try to save the bison, some of which may or may not have been that helpful. But the thing that he did that we know was very helpful was that he became director of the Bronx Zoo. And when he got there, he started raising a herd of bison at the zoo. And here he is in 1907 in the black hat and the stick, bidding farewell to his bison herd as he sends them off by train to Oklahoma, where they were the founding animals in a herd that has now seeded herds all over the continent. So he wasn't the only savior of the bison, of course, but he did have a big part in it. And we really do have him to thank, at least in part, for the fact that we have relatively healthy populations of bison on the plains today. Now, the reason, or one of the reasons why he was so complicated, is that he did this, as I say in the book, a lot of early conservationists did the wrong thing for the right reasons and the right thing for the wrong reasons. And his reasons for protecting the bison were, um, like many other conservationists of his time. This is his friend, future President Teddy Roosevelt. In his late 20s, he was a good friend of William Hornaday's and shared Hornaday's concern for the bison. But both of them, while they had a genuine appreciation for this species and saw it as, majestic and beautiful and valuable, their reasons for protecting it were all wrapped up with their own sense of nationalism. They saw it as a symbol, a national symbol that needed to be protected. They also saw it as a means of protecting what they saw as the threatened state of white masculinity. There was this very pervasive idea at the time that men were kind of wilting away, white men were kind of wilting away in offices because they no longer got outside to do, manly things, and that the bison needed to be protected so that red-blooded American white men would go to the frontier and have this kind of bracing experience on the plains, as setting themselves against wild nature. And this is, you can see Teddy Roosevelt has fully embraced this idea. He is at this point in the middle of his own wilderness year in South Dakota after a political failure. He went to the frontier to kind of recover himself before returning to politics. And this picture was taken in New York City, but you can see he's all kitted out in buckskin and carrying his rifle and very much playing the mountain man, at least, and enjoying himself to the fullest. So there are 1,000 ironies about Hornaday's drive to save the bison, but one reason I like his story so much, despite its very dark chapters, is that he and I should say one of the darkest chapters is that he had very little concern for the Native Americans who were devastated by the decline of the bison, and in fact he insisted that they were mostly responsible for the bison slaughter, even though there was a lot of contemporary evidence that said the exact opposite was true. And so one of the happy ironies is that in recent decades, these herds that Hornaday helped bring back to the prairie have in turn seeded herds that are now on reservations and First Nations land all over the continent, and are part of a tribal-led continent-wide strategy to return the bison to its ecological place on the landscape. Hornaday didn't really have a sense. He sort of treated bison like cows. He just put them on the train and plunked them out on the prairie without much of a sense. The science of ecology was quite young at the time, so he didn't have, understandably, didn't have much of a sense of the way other species related to the bison or were affected by them, and the way the landscape was affected by the presence of the bison. And but we know a lot more about that now. We know they're a keystone species, and that in their absence, the prairie has, or in their, in since their herds have become much smaller, the prairie has really suffered in many ways. So the idea now is to bring them back in larger numbers, and also to let them roam more freely by connecting some of the lands where they live on today, allowing them to move freely, for instance, from the land of the Blackfoot Nation in Montana to Glacier National Park, which is, of course, federal land. But these are bordering landscapes, and the hope is that they can take down the fences fairly soon and let these animals move between the two places, and in that way recover some of their former migration patterns, and then recover at least part of their place in the ecosystem. So switching from bison to birds, I think I'm switching phyla there. The bison was a iconic chapter in the early history of conservation, and right alongside of that was the rise of concern for bird species. And birds, have been exploited in many ways throughout human history, but at the time, one threat to them was the fact that people who wanted to enjoy birds often just shot them in order to get a good look at them. There were not cheap binoculars available at the time. And so, if you were a scientist or if you were an amateur birder and you wanted to look closely at a bird and study it, you had to shoot it. And people often shot birds without much thought about what might happen to the species. And of course, scientists still collect birds today for study, collect, quote unquote, meaning they shoot them and they bring a few home, but they do it in a much more limited, much more careful way, and only when they feel that it's absolutely necessary to their work, for they want to do DNA studies or something like that. But at this time, people were just shooting birds wholesale. Thinking, well, this is, this is good for science, so it's probably okay. Or, I'm really interested in these birds, so it's probably okay that I take a whole bunch and look at them closely. But once binoculars did become available, all of a sudden there was this whole other way of appreciating birds and of seeing living birds, which people had never been able to do before, which is kind of funny to think about. And one of the most important promoters of birding with binoculars was this woman named Florence Marion Bailey, and her life story is really cool. She wrote a book called Birds Through an Opera Glass, which was published in 1889, and she was just out of Smith College. She had kind of a precocious interest in wildlife, and she told people how to use this new technology to look up close at birds. It was the first non-scientific birding guide, and it just the pastime of birding is something that people would do on weekends just exploded because people loved being able to see these birds in life and up close. And Florence Marion Bailey showed them how to do it. And she went on to live a long life full of adventures, and she wrote many more books. And she camped around the West for 40 years, 3 seasons a year with her husband, and often wrote about it. But when she died, she was not remembered in the New York Times for her important work. And that was corrected just a couple of years ago as part of the New York Times series Overlooked No More. She finally got her own obituary in the New York Times. The other threat to birds at the time was from hats. um, birds were being shot for by amateurs out of interest, and by researchers for scientific research, and they were also being shot wholesale by plume hunters to supply the millinery trade. And there was a fad for feather decorated hats at the time, and like most fads, it escalated to an extreme degree. And it's really fun, actually, even though it's macabre, it's fun to look at some of these old pictures because people were wearing not only whole birds like the woman on the left, but they were sometimes wearing taxidermied rodents and little sort of terraria on their heads, moss and rocks and things. And so they were wearing wings, as you can see. I love this like single straight feather sticking up from this woman's head. And then I especially love this kind of wicker laundry basket effect with these feathers on top that are probably at least half as tall as the woman who's wearing them. And this was a fad started in the mid to late 1800s and really escalated into the 20th century. And it had, as you can imagine, a very tragic effect on bird populations around the world. And this picture is part of a famous series of photographs that were taken by a photographer in Australia, who happened to see a plume hunter kill a mother egret. And then, so he documented her death and then documented what happened to the baby egrets after she left, which of course they weren't old enough to feed themselves, so they died. So, often every bird killed meant that 3 or 4 more would die. And this is a picture of hummingbird skins sold for 2 cents each. And this was the quarterly London feather sale. So this kind of thing happened 4 times a year, which gives you the sense of scale. And the rough estimate is that 5 million birds were killed for the plume trade each year at the height of the feather craze. So the reaction of William Hornaday and his sporting companions, who were early members of the conservation movement, was, of course, somewhat predictably to blame the wearer of the hat. And there were a lot of cartoons like this at the time of fancy women in fancy dress shooting birds or strangling them, or somehow, kind of leering evilly at beautiful birds. And Hornaday himself wrote an essay for the women's section of the New York Times, which someone should have told him that insulting your audience was probably not the best way to accomplish your job. He says, "Woman, the juggernaut of the bird world." And Virginia Woolf, really, as she was wont to do, really put these people in their place by responding to a male conservationist who took this line of argument by saying, "Look, I have no sympathy for the society woman who thinks that a lemon-colored egret is a fine addition to her evening wear, but let's remember that the birds are killed by men, starved by men, and tortured by men." And women were also, in addition to not killing birds directly, they were also at the forefront of the effort to protect birds from the plume trade. And this is another woman who was, along with Florence Marion Bailey, very active in the effort um, to establish laws that would limit the effects of the plume trade and to raise awareness of the depredations of this fad and of this business. And Harriet Hemingway is very interesting. She was part of a very wealthy Boston family. This is her portrait, painted by John Singer Sargent, and she was so strategic in what we would today call using her privilege to make change. She got together all of her fancy friends in small groups for society teas and convinced them to said, look what's happening to these egrets, this is terrible, don't you think we should stop wearing these hats, and really change the conventional wisdom in Boston, among the Boston elite about these hats, and then resuscitated the Audubon Society, which was kind of dormant at the time, by founding the Massachusetts chapter of the Audubon Society. And she recognized that due to the prejudice of the time, she was not likely to get a whole lot done or be taken very seriously as a public figure. So she went out and recruited a bunch of prominent men to be the public face of the Audubon Society, and then remained the power behind the throne. So and then these activists eventually won. In 1918, they passed the Congress passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which uh, basically destroyed the plume trade, both in the US and Canada. The treaty that it speaks of was between the US and Canada, makes it a crime to capture, kill, or sell a migratory bird or any of its parts. And then in 1921, the UK passed an equivalent law, and many other European countries passed similar laws. So that destroyed the market and it destroyed the plume trade. And it's, we don't, in the conservation movement, we don't really take stock of our victories, but it's amazing to think the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was actually under threat in the Trump administration, and it was amazing to look back and think, what would have happened had these activists not passed this law? There are many gorgeous birds that we consider so important today that in not so gorgeous birds that we consider important today that we may well not have had, because that the trade was just racing along and there was no law in place to stop it. It seems crazy today, but that was the way it was. And these activists, by working together, brought it about and destroyed the trade and saved these species. So just one more, well, two more characters before I open it up to questions. This is Rosalie Edge, who came into the conservation movement after the victory over the plume trade, and she was a suffragist, like many of these women who were active in the early years of the conservation movement. She learned some pretty badass activist skills in the suffrage movement, and she brought them to the conservation movement. And she told uh, the early conservationists who like William Hornaday were kind of interested in protecting species that they like to hunt. She said, look, this conservation shouldn't just be about protecting species you like to hunt, and it also shouldn't be about protecting beautiful birds, as important as that is. It should be about protecting all species, including birds of prey, which at the time were considered to be a pest by many people. It was thought that they preyed on game birds, and they were generally looked down upon as kind of a worse class of bird. They were thought to be scavengers and just not kind of nasty creatures. And she said that's ridiculous. We need to protect all species. And she wasn't formally educated in science, but she had a way of finding willing mentors to teach her, and she was very sharp, and she had uh, a very precocious understanding of ecology and understanding why it was important to protect all species. So she told the Audubon Society that they needed to broaden their mission, and she raised such a ruckus that they eventually did. After she won that battle, she moved on to protecting Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which is a ridge top in western Pennsylvania that where hunters used to go and shoot birds at close range because they so many of them passed over this one ridge top and during the migratory season. She saw this photo of hawk carcasses lined up after a weekend of hunting, was just shocked and decided she was going to lease the land. And in her words, everything is rentable, uh, from an ocean liner to an evening dress. Why not a mountain? And she eventually bought the place. Here she is in 1940. And one of the very important things she did that she didn't know was going to be as important as it turned out to be was that she turned to the man on the right with the white hat and said, "Look, he was the caretaker of Maurice Brown." And she said, "Look, I think you should count the number of birds that are going over each season and what type they are, and we should do that regularly. We should do it every year." And he did. And I think there was a break in the record during World War II for a couple of years, but it extended from the 1930s to the present day. It's now the longest record we have of raptor migration. And you can still go to Hawk Mountain today. If you haven't been, I highly recommend it. If you do end up on the East Coast, it's a gorgeous place, and birds will fly almost literally right over your head. The wind currents are so strong that they're almost being just blasted at you by these gales, and they'll fly above and even to the side and under these ledges. So one of the visitors that Hawk Mountain got in its early years was a woman named Rachel Carson, who at the time was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service and writing magazine articles, kind of thinking she'd like to be a writer. And she was very impressed by this beautiful place, Hawk Mountain, and she wrote a fragment about it that was never published, but it clearly made an impression on her. And then 15 years after this, when she started to work on her masterpiece, Silent Spring, she wrote to the caretaker Maurice Brown, who I pointed out in the previous photograph, and said, "Hey, I've heard that you have seen a decline in eagle numbers in recent years." And he said, "Well, yes, we have, and we know it's unusual, at least in recent decades, because we've been taking records for so long, and we know it's been pretty abrupt. You know, there were young eagles one year, and then there were very few, and now there are almost none." And that turned out to be a pillar in her case against DDT that she made in Silent Spring. So I just it gives me a lot of hope to think about the fact that Rosalie Edge took it upon herself to start this data set that has extended now for almost 100 years. And that had she not done so, Rachel Carson might have had a much weaker case against DDT. And as it was, it took quite a few years after the publication of Silent Spring to ban DDT. And had her case not been as strong as it was, it might have taken longer. It might not have happened at all. And we might be living in a very different world. So, excuse me, where is the hope that I promised you at the beginning? uh, for me, researching the history of conservation, which of course extends for many decades after the stories I just told you and goes through many more twists and turns, um, for me, the hope is in the lesson that change takes time and the work of many hands, and that the people who we now know have accomplished great things often didn't know that during their lifetime. They didn't know what they were starting. They usually had very little sense that it was going to do any good. They just did it because they thought it was right and they thought there was a chance it might do some good. So just a few examples. Hornaday sent his bison herd to Oklahoma in 1907. It's only now that they are, more than a century later, that they're starting to come back to the ecosystem in a significant way. UK's first plumage bill was proposed in 1909, and activists had to fight for another dozen years to actually pass that law. Rachel Carson, as I said, caused a sensation with Silent Spring, but DDT wasn't banned until a decade later. In fact, by the founders of the Environmental Defense Fund. If you've heard of the Environmental Defense Fund, which now works all over the world, they started out as a bunch of volunteer activists from Long Island who thought that DDT sounded like a bad deal, and they had some volunteer lawyers in their ranks, and they took a bunch of DDT producers and distributors to court and eventually persuaded the EPA to ban it. But it took a long time. And finally, Rosalie Edge started speaking up for birds of prey in 1929, and the bald eagle was removed from the Endangered Species Act list finally in 2011. So she never lived to see the good work or the great results of the work that she began. And then on the other hand, change can also happen quickly. We've seen this year some, in the past year, in the course of 2020, we saw some seismic changes, many of them bad. But I think for those of us who think about climate change and think about conservation and think about the behavioral changes that may be required to fix those problems, there was a weird kind of hope in the fact that the planet, the human population, radically changed its typical behavior in the course of just a few weeks. And that's, there were all sorts of and continue to be all sorts of problems in our response to COVID-19. But it was shocking, in the speed of the response uh, was so fast that it was quite shocking and disorienting, I think, to most of us. And it did, I think, give a lot of people hope that perhaps something of that sort could be accomplished for climate change or for conservation. We at least know that we are capable of it, if not willing to do so. And so for me, the hope that I found in the history of conservation lies in the uncertainty, in that we don't know, none of us know the end of our story, and in the possibility that even though, there are many days when I have looked out my window in this past year, into wildfire smoke or into the ongoing pandemic or into, terrible headlines, political and otherwise, and thought, this is not looking good. But we don't, as I said, know the ending to any of our stories. We don't know what's going to happen after we're gone, and there is always the possibility that might be a lot better than we think. And I think beyond hope, what we most need to look squarely at conservation and some of these other global crises is not so much hope, because we may never, the things we do may never pay off, or we may not be around to see them. But I think we need resolve, and just the resolve that we're going to do the right thing and take the chance that it's going to have a better effect than we might sometimes think it will. And and to that end, I often, when I do feel slightly hopeless, I take refuge in a quote from Aldo Leopold, who I also write about in the book, and who I consider a real for he was very ahead of his time, and he continues, even though he was writing in the 30s and 40s, I think continues to be so relevant today. And he's not just a beautiful writer, but was a very I would just say generous thinker, a wise person. And I think we could still learn a lot from him. And what he said in one of his darker moods, he was really quite optimistic, but he wrote to a friend and said that the situation is hopeless should not prevent us from doing our best. And I think that that was true then, and I think it's true today. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions or talk further, whatever's interesting to you. Thanks so much.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you so much. I think we do have a couple people who might have questions. Oh, we got some clapping hands from one of our from one of our attendees. Um, I think this is so great too, because it's Earth Month. Earth Day is in a couple weeks, Arbor Day, those things that kind of maybe make us think about it when we don't during the rest of the year about what we can do. Do you follow the citizen scientist kind of movement, the hashtag that you see online sometimes?
I don't follow the hashtag, but I do follow the movement, and it's pretty exciting to me. not just in the sense of the obvious good of getting people out into nature and appreciating other species and all the benefits that those experiences can bring, but also in my reporting about conflicts over wildlife between people. Some of those are just so entrenched, as we know here in the West. There are, ongoing conflicts over wolves and other predators, and there are similar conflicts in almost everywhere in the world. And researchers, some of the most encouraging anecdotes I've heard from people who are involved in those conflicts or trying to resolve those conflicts are that once people, real opponents of predators, people who are, say, really suspicious of wolves, um, something that unexpectedly is a great help in resolving those conflicts is getting people involved in the research on those animals. And once they're collecting the data themselves, and once they're also given credit and respect for knowing their own landscapes, they trust the data and they kind of come around to the idea that it might be possible to protect these species without undue sacrifices. So I think those efforts can be really beneficial on a lot of levels.
Yeah, so I would recommend anybody who's listening right now to look up that citizen scientist movement. There's a kids press that I work with who we're really focused on the birding one, because there's a
Mm,
great thing with the Audubon Society where they ask kids to get them really involved to document what birds are coming in and out of their backyard, and there's a specific time frame that they really want the information, but then you give it to them and then they can track these migratory patterns of birds. And I just think it's so cool um, to also get kids back outside and not
mm.
on a computer, but kind of empowering them to keep track of the birds that are just in their own backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Kathleen has a question. um,
Before you go on, I just wanted to mention, I don't know if this is the same effort, but it's certainly a similar one, that the Seek app
mhm.
that was developed by the California Academy of Sciences and National Geographic is an app. There's an app called iNaturalist, which gather to gather this kind of citizen data. But there's also an app that's specifically for kids and meant for kids to be able to use on their own to gather this kind of data. And it's really cool. And so it's called Seek, and it's really, if you have kids or no kids, it's really worth checking out. And there's a organization called the City Nature Challenge, which asks people in urban areas to record their own wildlife. And then you can kind of, you can look at the data that you and others have collected and see what the patterns are, which is, I think, really a satisfying part of that, especially for young people. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so we do have a couple of questions. So Kathleen's asked, when you approached, well, what,
Norton, my publisher. Yeah.
yeah, so you proposed this to them, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
that same way that, and nonfiction proposals can be a little different than people think when it comes to fiction books. So how did they react when you brought them this book?
Well, Norton was gung ho, but since we're a small, intimate group, I will tell you that I talked to many editors who were not very gung ho, and in a kind of interesting way in retrospect. I mean, I feel like I found the perfect home for this book at Norton, because they know how to nurture and sell science and nature books, and they don't consider them second class citizens. And I had a wonderful editor who believed in this project from the start. But I did talk to many editors who were not so keen on this project, and either they would say, well, we know this already, this is an old story, because they kind of had the same view of the conservation movement I think I did, which was like, well, there was John Muir and then there was Rachel Carson and some other stuff happened in between. They kind of like were familiar with the outlines, but they didn't know there was this whole other history. Or they would be like, that's way too much, like it can't be one book, if they knew a little bit more about how complicated it was. So looking back, those were both, valid sort of hesitations. And fortunately, I found a place where I had a great support in taking on what turned out to be a very difficult, as I said, but rewarding project.
Excellent. So we've got a hand raised from Leah. So Leah, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Hold on just one second. Where'd you go? So you can ask your question. So feel free to turn your mic on. There you go.
Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much for talking. I really appreciate it. And my question was just, you had mentioned that previously you were a biology major and your career was very biology oriented. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your transition from being a biologist to being a journalist and what kind of was your reason for doing that and what was the process of doing that? Thank you.
Well, I majored in biology in college, and I I was really interested in biology, but I don't think I ever saw myself as a researcher or having sort of the laser focus that a career in research describe or requires. I was more of a generalist, and I think when I was younger, I saw that as kind of a like perhaps a handicap or a bad thing. Like, oh, I just want to know a little bit about a lot of things. But I've come to embrace it, and I've come to appreciate that the world needs people who are generalists and are interested in making connections among disparate things, and which is really what I love to do and what I get to do as a journalist. I get to learn about a lot of different projects and make the connections between them, and it's what I got to do in this book. I didn't discover Rachel Carson, that's for sure. I didn't, all of these people were well known and have been written about elsewhere, but I think hopefully what I was be able to contribute was to show how they influence each other and how that movement has developed over time and how they fit into this bigger picture. So how I made the transition, I think that's what you asked at the end, um, was that I got an internship and then a job at High Country News, which is based in Western Colorado, and they still have a great fellowship program. If you know any aspiring environmental journalists, they have a great internship and fellowship program that is now paid and is, because High Country News is a relatively small shop, is very much an immersion in journalism. It's not a making coffee clipping articles kind of fellowship. And I learned on the job there. I didn't go to graduate school in journalism, but I was a staff writer and an editor for about 4 years, and then I went freelance as a magazine journalist. And uh, it was really I really enjoyed science. I loved learning about science, but I was at least as interested in the scientists and the people who were affected by science as I was by what they were studying or what I was studying. So journalism was the perfect path for me. And sometimes I feel like I'm cheating. I still, years later, feel like I'm cheating when I show up to a field site. I still get to spend a fair amount of time on field projects. And I show up to a field site and say, "Great, thanks for having me. So, what have you been doing for the last 20 years?" And they tell me, and then I leave, after a couple of days, and I feel like, oh, I've had all the fun. And of course, I haven't, not from their perspective, but I feel like I've gotten to have all the fun without all the effort.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that question. Um, so do we have any more questions? Feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Michelle was nice enough to send us some book plates to the store. So if you haven't picked up your copy yet, head to Roundabout and there is a signed book plate to put in. So because we're not in person, you still get a signed book. And then we have a couple other things to kind of give away. So Leah, I wanted to ask you, since you just asked the question, if you're local to Bend or the Central Oregon area. You are?
I am.
Perfect.
Yeah.
We have a very cute little field notebook that was sent to us from the publisher. So I'm going to tell the bookstore that you are one of the people that gets one of the cute little field notebooks. So when you're in Roundabout, let them know you'll get a cute little prize.
Cool. They are cute.
Very adorable. They have the part of the cover is on the outside of the notebook, and so it's very cool. That cover is amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful cover, very eye-grabbing.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of times we ask authors, what's your next project? But your book did only come out a month ago.
Yeah.
So I think right now it's just you're going to continue to kind of tell people about this book and why they, what are does this book for you hopefully get more people involved in conservation?
I hope so. I really hope so, because I feel like, I mean, my hope is how should I say, it's measured. I'm not, I'm not running around feeling optimistic all the time, but I do have a sense that there's so much untapped possibility in conservation, and that, as apocalyptic as things can seem sometimes, conservation has learned so much over the last 150 years, and it's just at the brink of really starting to crack some of these big questions of how people can live alongside other species, that we can be more sophisticated. We're always going to need national parks and reserves, but that we can have a spectrum of strategies, that some of which involve people living sustainably with other species long term. And there's so much to be done, and so much good that can be accomplished, I think, despite the challenges. That I hope people will get involved in conservation, and I hope, it would be a dream come true were this book to help point the way to people who are looking for a way to get involved in conservation, and kind of looking for future directions of the movement.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you one more question because I always have them.
Of course, yeah.
What tell us maybe one or two books besides yours, and maybe Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Yeah, no,
everyone should read it. What are some other books that you would recommend people to either read on, this topic?
Well, kind of a fun one. I'm call it a light read, because it's one that that reveals new depths every time I look at it. But it's not directly addressing the problems we're talking about here. But my friend Elena Passarello has written an essay collection called Animals Strike Curious Poses, which is wonderful, not just because it references Prince in the title, but because it's a book of really lovely literary essays about species or individual animals who have for some reason or another acquired individual names, have been famous in their time, and it's full of insight and beautifully written, and I highly recommend it. Gosh, there's so many others. I do, as I mentioned, recommend the work of Aldo Leopold. He can sometimes, he lived decades ago, but and can sometimes be thought of as an old fuddy-duddy. But I really think his work is just full of energy, and get the slightly dated style of it. So I highly recommend it. And I see there's a suggestion from Riley E. O. Wilson's Diversity of Life. Yes, for sure. Classic work on biodiversity and why it's important.
Excellent. Thank you, Riley, for that suggestion. Yeah, I'm always happy to hear, add books to your to be read pile, right? Like we don't all have enough time for these, but these are important works. So again, I just want to remind everyone, you can pick up a copy of Michelle's book at Roundabout. We're open every day 10 to 5. If you need it delivered, if you need it on the red bench, we'll make the accommodations for you. And hopefully, Michelle will be able to have you in the store at some point in the future, maybe for the paperback release in the next year. And we'll actually, have you there to talk to people in person. I miss it. So yeah, if we don't have any more questions, Kathleen's waving goodbye. Thank you again so much for being here, Michelle. Your support of indie bookstores is so necessary, and everyone who was here tonight, thank you so much for supporting our store and for supporting authors like Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Kathleen, are you waving goodbye or telling us something?
No. I want to say something.
Okay.
For that. So I just got the book and I just started it, and I actually just love the quote from Aldo Leopold too. But the first thing I did was read the index. And it was fascinating to me, just going down that list of organizations and people, and I was just fascinated that you composed that index, because it's really cool too. So as I walked, that's all, no big deal.
Yeah, the end notes were sort of, the end notes were exhausting, but they were sort of fun in that way, and that they're a sort of a work of in their own right,
Yes, definitely.
Sort of planting little seeds and signposts that people might want to pursue after they finish the book. So thank you.
Excellent.
And thank you all for being here and for the great questions, and I really appreciate it, and hope to see you in person.
Yeah. All right. Wishing everyone a good night and happy weekend. Enjoy it outside. It's supposed to be nice. All right. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, take care. Take care, everyone. Be well.